Hello, good morning from Caracas, everyone. Afternoon, evening, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be here with you to initiate a series of webinars on the Global Biodiversity Framework and the links to SSC and the scientific community overall. It's this meeting is being recorded. The recording will be made available to anyone after it is over. But if you do not wish to be recorded, please leave the webinar now and watch the recording later on. I'm delighted to introduce our four panelists for today. We have Phil McGowan, who is the chair of a recently created Global Biodiversity Framework Task Force of the UCN Species Survival Commission. This is the new incarnation, the new name of this task force after several years of very successful work. Phil is based at Newcastle University, where we have a lot of activity around this theme developing. Welcome, Phil. Sean Hoban, who's a tree conservation biologist at the Morton Arboretum, another organization with which SSC has collaborated over the years and recently focusing a lot of efforts in the Centers of Species Survival on tree and conservation of trees. Anastasia Timoshina, she's the Traffic European Program Director and chair of the Medicinal Plant Specialist Group, co-chair of the Medicinal Plant Specialist Group of the Species Survival Commission. Again, lots of links that connect our organizations. And Eileen Mill, she's representing the Invasive Species Specialist Group. You know, it's a very relevant theme in the Global Biodiversity Framework and a major threat to biodiversity worldwide. She is also based at Newcastle University. So welcome, all of you. I will give the floor to Phil to begin the conversation. And if anybody has questions or comments, please introduce them into the chat. We're also streaming on Facebook, so introduce your comments there as well. We will compile all that information and have a session for questions. It's a really fantastic that you're here. As you know, with the Global Biodiversity Framework, a lot of new targets and priorities, we'll hear all about that, have come. A big role for governments to get more involved and report on progress. And we're hoping that with this series of webinars, we'll be able to inform and also, make sure that you activate people so that you are involved and engaged in this team. So over to Phil. Welcome, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John Paul, for the introduction, and thank you very much to your office for initiating and setting up this webinar. We hope it'll be the first of several, and we'd be more than happy to present and facilitate the sharing of information about the framework, and particularly the species elements, as we got the opportunity to dive in a little bit more deeply after this webinar. So the intention now is to give you a little bit of an introduction to the framework itself, and particularly concentrate on the species elements and targets that are very relevant to the membership of the Species Survival Commission. So just before I start talking about the framework, a couple of key points really. The negotiation of this framework, for a long time we had the name, our task force was the post-2020 Global Biodiversity and Biodiversity Targets Task Force, because for a long time the intention was that that the new Global Biodiversity Framework would be adopted in 2020. Obviously with COVID, that was not possible. And so we've ended up with a 4-year negotiation process, which in some ways was good to have a little bit longer to iron out some key challenges, but in others was a huge challenge because some negotiations tried to take place online and those were perhaps not quite as successful. But anyway, we get to COP15 in December 2022, and the opening of COP included a really powerful address from the UN Secretary General. We are waging a war on nature. Ecosystems have become playthings of profit, and we need a peace pact with nature. So certainly from the highest levels of the UN, there was a very clear message that negotiators and all those other stakeholders present needed to pull together to find compromises, to find a form of words that would ultimately be called the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. COP itself and an additional open-ended working group, which was convened immediately before COP because of many outstanding issues, did reveal just how much diversity there is across the globe, both in terms of what we need to aim for, but also in terms of where the resources would come in order to actually achieve this global biodiversity framework. And it was the outcome, whether or not we would have a global biodiversity framework, was very unclear right until the end, the last few days, and when the ministers became involved. But another thing and a cause of optimism that was very clear is that research responding to clear needs was recognised. So efforts led by the Species Survival Commission, or to which SSC contributed substantially, around Target 4 and genetic diversity were particularly evident. So that's something, as we go into implementation, we should bear in mind. Research responding to needs can really play a significant role. So the framework itself, it's about 5,000 words running over 11 pages, really falls into 3 significant chunks. The first chunk is 5 sections that contain the background, the purpose of the framework, considerations which are really underlying principles for the implementation of the framework. They're definitely worth having a look at because they are going to become more and more important as the framework is implemented, evaluated, and reported upon. The main part, which has attracted most attention and will continue to attract most attention, is the 2050 vision and the 2030 mission that contains the global goals, so the outcomes that we want to see for biodiversity and wider CBD objectives are to be achieved by 2050. And there are 4 of those goals. A series of targets which identify the actions that will be necessary to achieve those outcomes. They are scheduled, 23 of those, scheduled to be revised in 2030. So we've got 2 different timeframes. The outcomes that we want to see are to be achieved by 2050, but the first suite of actions, the targets, are to be achieved by 2030. And then the final few sections are all about how we implement, report, and communicate the Global Biodiversity Framework. So looking at those first, the goals and the targets. So as I mentioned, there are 4 goals and there are 23 targets. So the one specifically about the conservation of biodiversity, which is the first objective of the CBD, there's 1 goal and there are 8 immediately supporting objectives, targets. Clearly, all of those targets are relevant, but there are 8 that are directly related to reducing pressures on biodiversity and undertaking urgent recovery action. And then there's a suite of indicators which are still being negotiated, still being discussed, and will come up again for discussion at COP16, which is in Cali in Colombia in late October of this year. So the goal, beginning to get down to the real details that we'll be interested in, contains 3 parts, and CBD defines biodiversity according to 3 levels, which is also sort of fits the IUCN definition of biodiversity. So there's a clause, there's a number of issues there to do with ecosystems. There are 3 elements related to species, and then there is genetic diversity. So those are the 3 levels of biodiversity. And the 3 elements for species that are highlighted there in bold is 1 to do with stopping extinctions, 1 to do with extinction risk, which is globally measured by the IUCN Red List. And then finally, which is new, it was not in the HE Biodiversity Target 12, a new element, and that is trying to ensure that species in the wider landscape remain or are restored to abundant levels, healthy and resilient levels. So the species elements, the kind of the core, we'll hear more about other targets, related targets, but the core part where SSC really has got an enormous role to play is in trying to deliver this goal, how all the different targets can act to achieve those outcomes that we want to see in Goal A, but then specifically looking at Target 4. Target 4 is included in the framework because there is a recognition that even if we reduce all of the other pressures, so we reduce the pressures from land and sea use change, we reduce pressures from invasive alien species, climate change, pollution, and overexploitation, there will still be many species that need urgent management actions because they've got small populations, they've got threats like emerging wildlife diseases, which are not covered in the other targets. So more than 50% of species that are in the comprehensively assessed red list groups will need urgent management actions. So there's a clear mandate there for the Species Survival Commission to play a leading role. And the wording does recognise that it is critical to take a holistic view, looking both ex situ as well as in situ. And a final area where I think we do have a significant role to play is in indicators. So there are the indicators I put up there for goal A and for target 4. What is very interesting, these are the proposed headline indicators. The red list index, which is derived from the red list, which many of us contribute to, is a very appropriate indicator for goal A because it's measuring the outcome, and that is the conservation status of species. At the moment, it is also included as an indicator for target 4. But if we think that target 4 is all about ensuring urgent recovery actions, that is an action, it's not the outcome. So the red list index is not at the moment an appropriate index, and there is increasing recognition that that is not the best indicator for target 4. So one of the things that we in the task force are keen to explore is how we can develop an indicator that measures urgent recovery action is underway for the species that need it. So just taking a step back then and thinking, how can we help support parties and others in implementing these species elements in the framework? Looking simply, and this is an information document that we provided a couple of COPs ago, COP 13, it shows just how many threatened species countries have. So if you are a country like Indonesia, for example, with over 1,000 threatened species, developing action plan by action plan is not going to be realistic, either in terms of resources or in terms of political, gaining political momentum. So what we've started to do in the task force is think, what is it we want to achieve? So what we want to achieve are outcomes for species. So it is stopping those extinctions. It's reducing extinction rate. Those are the two I'm going to concentrate on here. So the first step is to tackle those underlying pressures. And the second step is then to look at those species that need intensive management action and to identify what actions are needed for those species. We have shown that urgent recovery action has prevented extinctions. So since the CBD came into force in 1993, it's prevented the extinction of between 28 and 48 bird and mammal extinctions. And even since 2010, when the HE biodiversity targets were adopted, there's between 11 and 25 species would have gone extinct without urgent recovery reaction. So we know that urgent recovery action can make a difference. What we need to do now is support parties in identifying which species need that action and what that action is. So in terms of tackling underlying pressures, just as I move towards the last 2 or 3 slides to finish, the work that a colleague here at Newcastle University has led, working across the task force, wider SSC, and indeed IUCN, developing the species threat abatement and restoration metric, has shown that there are 5 countries that have got particular importance in terms of global species extinction risk. And those are the darker coloured countries. So Brazil, Mexico, Madagascar, Indonesia are 4 of those countries. And using this metric, developed from using the IUCN Red List, we can also identify the particular pressures that are evident. What we can do is look at that for each country. So working with a long-standing SSC collaborator, Domitilla Raimondo, we've looked at this for endemic plants in South Africa. And we can see whether we're looking for the threat for all endemic plants, we're looking at threats driven by invasive species, or whether we're looking at the restoration opportunities, which are those three figures presented. Spatially, the plants are all occurring in the same place. So that gives us a real insight, gives the South African party a real insight into where the action needs to take place. And by identifying the targets up in the top left, it indicates which are the particular threats. So therefore, it's clear that tackling target 6, invasive alien species, is going to have a huge benefit for South Africa's endemic plant species. And then thinking of those urgent management actions, as I've mentioned, we've undertaken research based using the IUCN Red List that's shown, and this was actually mentioned in negotiations at COP15, which was very gratifying for SSC. The extinction risk for 57% of those comprehensively assessed groups would not be reduced sufficiently without target 4. So we've now got the method that allows us to identify those species, and therefore we can help inform parties which those species are and begin to track what action is being put in place for those species. And just to give examples, SSC very much organised along taxonomic specialist groups. So the target 4 species, just to pick out 3 groups. So looking at cats, these are the different reasons. You could be a target 4 species because you've got a small population. You need species-specific action that's identified in the Red List documentation, or you've got a particular threats that are not covered elsewhere. So for cats, a smaller number of species than the two bird groups, but clearly wide-ranging species with very, very challenging issues. But that begins to give us some kind of numbers that SSC specialist groups could perhaps begin to think about. So just finally concluding then with some immediate thoughts on the first part of this journey to 2030. There's clearly a balance for us to think with our groups, our organisations, SSC as a whole, between breadth and depth. There are 4 goals and 23 targets. We can't probably, with our community, tackle all of those, but we can work to complement what is happening elsewhere. We really do need to focus on the outcomes. So what are the goals that we want to achieve? So the goals there, the elements there for species in Goal A are very clear of what we should be trying to pursue. Not thinking about what's best for my organisation or what activities are we currently involved in. We will need, all of us, to do a little bit of realignment. But having said that, there's certainly plenty of existing initiatives that fit very neatly into achieving the goals and the targets of the framework. So let's try and align those existing initiatives, do a little bit of modifying if need be, but where we do have the opportunity to start new initiatives in the next few years, please let's try and align those as closely as we can with the Global Biodiversity Framework and consider, are we maintaining that alignment on a regular basis? So as I said, we do need to think how to contribute to achieving those species outcome goals in the species outcome elements of Goal A, halting extinctions, reducing extinction risk, and seeing healthy and resilient populations. The inclusion of species abundance is new, and it's going to be a big challenge to put in practice. And there will be a huge amount of expertise across SSC in, for example, monitoring. So there are great schemes for some well-studied taxonomic groups in some parts of the world that have got a big tradition. So birds in Europe are very well established monitoring techniques. But how do we reach out to try and ensure that freshwater fish in Panama or plants in the Cameroon, how can we make sure that we are measuring, and we've got an idea of how to measure whether we've got healthy and resilient populations? Target 4 is an obvious focus for many taxonomic groups and other groups in the Species Survival Commission. Identified 4,500 or so species need Target 4 action. Especially, we do need to think of an indicator for target 4, as well as looking at healthy and resilient populations. So what management actions, how can we identify and track that management actions are underway for target 4 species? Filling that gap would be a key contribution towards this implementation. So thank you very much for listening. There's the goal A, and particularly, please do pay attention to that second clause. We, as a Species Survival Commission, have got the huge opportunity to be a real global focus for science informing policy in the Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil. Before I give the floor to Sean, I just realized I never introduced myself, which is what I usually do. So my name is John Paulo Rodriguez. I chair the UCN Species Survival Commission that I'm sure many of you know. We have 230 people connected, which is really fantastic. Thank you. The SSC is a global network of about 10,000 experts on species in about 186 countries last time we counted. So it's a really strong force. If you're not familiar with SSC, I invite you to connect. And we will, as we said at the beginning, we'll take the question and answers at the end of the session. So over to you. Thank you so much, Phil. The Newcastle University has become like the intellectual hub for this theme. So thank you so much for all the work that you do. And over to Sean. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Phil, for the intro, and JP for that. I'm Sean Hoban. I work at the Morton Arboretum. If you're having problems seeing my slides, let me know, but I think they're showing up okay. I'm presenting on behalf of the Conservation Genetics Specialist Group within the IUCN, as well as several other groups we've collaborated with. I'll be talking about how the IUCN CGSG engaged with the CBD Global Biodiversity Framework, especially on target 4 and genetic diversity. I'll go over the wording of the genetic diversity element and how we engaged with the post-2020 process. I'll also talk about an analysis of CBD national reports, how countries reported on genetic diversity in the past, which tells us a little bit about country capacity and needs for the future. And I'll talk about indicators for genetic diversity, how our team developed and is producing support tools for genetic diversity indicators. Genetic diversity is important because it helps species adapt to environmental and climate change and new diseases. It also helps make ecosystems more resilient to extreme weather and disturbance events, and it is vital for ensuring ecological restoration success. Here's the wording of target 4 with respect to genetic diversity. I just want to explain a couple clauses. To maintain and restore genetic diversity, that means do not lose the current amount of genetic diversity we have, but also perform actions to benefit genetic diversity. So that is especially reconnecting populations and supplementing population sizes. Within and between populations, these are two components of genetic diversity. The first refers to inbreeding and adaptation, the speed of adaptation within populations, and the second refers to the genetic diversity across species ranges, therefore the options a species has for surviving an uncertain future. And then maintain adaptive potential. This emphasizes that the outcome of conserving genetic diversity is to give species, again, this ability to adapt in a changing environment. And more on that can be found in this paper, in which we chart the evolution of the goals and targets with respect to genetic diversity over time, as the GBF developed over those 4 years that Phil mentioned. The CGSG and colleagues engaged with the GBF process for about 3.5 years. We produced a lot of scientific papers, but it was more than just producing scientific papers on the state of knowledge of genetic diversity. It was also engaging with webinars through the GeoBond and through the CBD Secretariat. It was also producing policy briefs, such as those shown here, 1 to 2 page summaries that we distributed to CBD national focal points. And as you can see, we tried to make sure that these were available in as many languages as possible, which is needed for global engagement. We tried to track all the requests coming out of the CBD, who frequently request peer review comments. So we made comments as the GBF draft developed and tried to engage also at Substa. And then lastly, we attended the in-person COP15 meeting, where we gave presentations to the delegates, shown here. And we also had a booth where people could come ask us questions at COP15 regarding genetic diversity. And this was generously sponsored by the GBike network in Europe and also in partnership with Teobon. So that is about how we engaged with the GBF leading up to the wording of Target 4 on genetic diversity. At the same time, we also looked back at how countries had reported on genetic diversity previously. So countries have to report about every 4 years through national reports using indicators on the status of their biodiversity. So we analyzed 57 countries' national reports from 2014 and 2018, making a total of 114 national reports. And we looked at how much they were considering genetic diversity. We found that most countries mentioned genetic diversity at a high level, including in the executive summary, but a large proportion, more than 1/5, did not include a genetic diversity target. Countries are supposed to include a national target analogous to each of the global targets, but countries are given a lot of flexibility in setting those national targets, and it's notable that more than 20% did not have reference to genetic diversity in their targets. I think that will change in the next round of national target setting. We also found that very few countries were reporting on indicators actually based on genetic diversity within and among populations. Most indicators used were respect to the size of seed banks or threatened breeds, because those were the only indicators available at the time. And few reports mentioned the development of national strategies on conservation genetics, even though that was a part of the Aichi Target 13. Lastly, I want to mention we analyzed actions that countries were taking, and mostly countries were taking actions around, or at least reporting on actions around seed and gene banks, breeding, research agencies, and law or policy, with much less actions being reported on training or education on conserving genetic diversity or studying and monitoring genetic diversity in space and time, with in situ projects somewhere in the middle. Okay, and then lastly, in an analysis of the national reports, we found that we looked for mentions of actual species, projects on species, genetic diversity, or knowledge on genetic diversity of certain species, and mostly these were referenced with relation to crops and farm relatives, much lesser degree crop wild relatives, forestry, and species of concern, and an even much less mention of genetic diversity with respect to wild harvested species, species providing ecosystem services, or culturally important species. So really a lot of species are being left out when countries are reporting on genetic diversity in the past, I think, and hope that will change in the next national reports. So I want to spend the rest of my time talking about genetic diversity indicators that were developed by the CGSG and partners. I'll explain these briefly. The proportion of populations with an effective size above 500. This is one of the headline indicators. This relates to what do we need populations to be at to halt genetic diversity loss. When populations are small, genetic diversity is lost over time. When populations are above an effective size of 500, genetic diversity loss is almost zero. So this is considered a sufficiently large size to prevent genetic losses. It has the added benefit of giving species an ability to adapt fairly quickly. It's a well-established concept in agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and conservation of threatened species. And so this seems like a very important indicator to track and report on. The other indicator we developed and are working with countries on is the proportion of distinct populations maintained. These two indicators reflect those two elements of within and between population genetic diversity. So distinct populations, as you might imagine, can harbor unique adaptations to local sea conditions, temperature, local pests or disease pressures, the timing of events like winter. So those local adaptations are really important to maintain to give the species a lot of options for the future. And this is a concept we can also fairly easily translate to the public and policymakers. So we designed these indicators. The question was then, are these actually feasible? So over the past 3 years, we worked with biodiversity agency personnel in 9 countries to actually test if data was available and what is the status of these indicators. We accomplished this a few months ago, and we have indicator values for more than 900 species in total, representing thousands of individual populations. Most species that we looked at had data for the indicators, and there are two big messages. For those species that we assessed, many species have most of their populations too small to maintain genetic diversity. So they are undergoing genetic erosion already, which highlights, complementary to what Phil said, a need for restoration and management to increase the size of populations and therefore increase this indicator and halt the loss of genetic erosion. The positive news is most species have not lost many populations for now, but a small fraction, about 10%, have lost substantial numbers of populations, which again emphasizes the need to act now. We have developed some support tools for parties so that they can calculate the indicator on their own. This includes a detailed guidebook, which we're kind of modeling after the guidance in the IUCN Red List guidelines, but there's a lot of work to do improving this. We also created a data collection form so that people can record information about effective population size and populations maintained. It's a nice form. It has a lot of rules and controlled vocabulary so that that data is kept in a standard manner. And then we have some open access, open source code that people can use for producing nice graphical summaries. All of these are kind of first draft because we've only been working on this for a few years, and we're hoping to receive a lot of feedback from the community so that we can improve these resources for the future, again, for reporting on genetic diversity indicators. So to summarize about the indicators, I want to emphasize DNA data is not needed. These indicators can be calculated just based on census and population data because they're based on conservation principles that say as census size changes and as populations are lost, there is a genetic impact. So we can do this without using any DNA studies, so all countries can participate. There is sufficient amount of data. It's fairly time efficient and has the added advantage of leveraging in-country knowledge and expertise. And it want to emphasize it's useful beyond CBD reporting. So these indicators are not just for reporting the state of genetic diversity, but they can be used for prioritizing species and populations, identifying what actions are needed for those populations, tracking change to see if those actions are effective, and raising alarm and communicating to the public and policy people. So again, indicators should be useful beyond just reporting. To summarize, there is a genetic diversity component in Target 4, which is imperfect, but it was improved through the CGSG engagement throughout the GBF process. We have looked at national reports to understand how countries reported genetic diversity in the past and gained a lot of lessons from that. And we're currently analyzing a different report called an NBSAP, National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans. We are currently analyzing those for genetic diversity to provide advice on those. And we have helped and are providing support for genetic diversity indicators. And this could not have been achieved without collaboration with a number of organizations which provide complementary expertise and leverage points, including NGOs, Botanic Gardens, and the CBD Secretariat. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Sean. Really, really amazing work. Very interesting. Lots to do with this. A lot to do in the future with the NBSAPs and supporting countries and integrating all these data and tools. So look forward to continued collaboration. Anastasia, over to you.
Very much and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. I'm just going to share my screen and take you through a different target. As Phil said, all completely related, being linked to species survival. So my little presentation focuses on Target 5 of the Global Biodiversity Framework and the sustainable use of wild species as a shorthand of it. What I will do is talk a little bit about the background, about what Target says, what some tools that could be useful for all of you, hopefully, to implement in order to help deliver on this target, and also talk a little bit about indicators in a similar way and the ways to engage. Okay, so the background and the really important motivation to why I even have this target is, this picture from the IBIS report a few years ago, which documented the kind of dramatic change in the biodiversity. And of course, all the reference points that SSC is directly involved in is already included in here through the red list assessments and so on. One thing I want to draw attention to here in terms of the direct drivers of biodiversity loss is this blue corner in here, out of which the darkest blue is the land and sea use change, and slightly lighter blue color is the direct exploitation. So we know from the science that especially for marine resources, but freshwater and terrestrial species are not too far away. Direct exploitation of resources is one of the key threats, combined with other threats to the survival of species. Okay, so our entry point is on understanding how direct exploitation affects the species, how to make sure it is sustainable where it happens, and what it all means. Another two pieces of kind of knowledge base that I'd like to bring into this conversation, and if you haven't seen them before, it's really worth taking a look, is one 2022 IBIS assessment report on the sustainable use of wild species, which is the first comprehensive assessment of all the best available knowledge on the use of wild species across the board, global assessment. And the second one, also published in 2022, is something called World Wildlife Trade Report, a flagship initiative, first one of its kind that was produced linked to the CITES Conference of Parties. And CITES is a convention on international trade in endangered species, which is, of course, regulating the trade in species internationally. That report is looking at the legal trade in species. So it start giving us some ideas as well on the context, the values, the trends that we should be aware of in this discussion. So what these two reports say, for instance, are some really important stats that we should be keeping in mind. So, for instance, there are figures such as estimates that 1 in 5 people around the world rely on wild plants, algae, and fungi for their food, income, and so on. We know something about the value of trade, and it's of use and trade. So this just focuses on trade, and of course, if we combine the importance of use for subsistence, for cultural needs, is much bigger. And also, I think in terms of the international trade, this diagram, which I'm not going to talk through, but I think it's often perceived news perceived numbers of articles, for example, on trade covering a lot animal species. But of course, plants, timber in particular, is the most significant commodity in international trade. So we know some context about the use of wild species. Target 5 of Global Biodiversity Framework is in front of you. I'm going to just highlight a few words in here. It's a long sentence to read, and I'm challenging anyone to try and do this in one breath. It's a subject of negotiations, and I think Phil has done such a good introduction explaining the long process of getting to the negotiated text of the Global Biodiversity Framework. What is really important is that this is the first time that under the Convention for Biological Diversity, despite the fact that one of its 3 objectives is the sustainable use of biodiversity, this is the first time that there is explicit target in GBF at the moment that speaks about the necessity to ensure that harvesting, use, and trade of wild species is sustainable, legal, and safe. So drawing attention to a few words here, because it is a complex target and it's a big commitment for the world. So one, use, harvest, and trade is covered, and they are nuanced but overlapping occasionally. So trade refers to commercial relationships. So once the species or products made out of species are in commerce. Sustainable, safe, and legal is something I'm going to take with me to one of the next slides. this nuance of how much the sustainability is defined and explained, preventing overexploitation, minimizing impacts on non-target species, so such as preventing bycatch, and ecosystems at large, reducing risk of pathogen spillover. So, and again, a nod to the importance of ensuring that any use, harvest, and trade is safe, and then applying ecosystem approach while respecting and protecting customer sustainable use by Indigenous peoples and local communities. Target 9 in the Global Biodiversity Framework, which I'm not going to talk about, is really closely related to Target 5. Target 9 is actually talking about the benefits and the increase in benefits that are derived from sustainable, safe and legal harvest, use and trade of wild species. So I think it's always useful to keep in mind there is this other set of targets. It sits in a different goal, but it is looking at the elements of actual benefits accrued from sustainable use. So where are we at the moment with this target? You know, how can we assess where we're present? So IBA's Sustainable Use Assessment Report suggests that the evidence of sustainable use is extremely varied. It's varied between species, it's varied between kind of geographical areas, and quite often we don't know, because for a lot of species, and this is, you know, we could think about the IUCN Red List, of course, some species groups are assessed comprehensively and reassessed and others aren't. So we might not have exact information about this to even set a good baseline. I really like this diagram, so I'll just pause for a second to introduce it. This is taken from the IBA Sustainable Use Assessment Report. And what this is talking about is the different elements of, apologies, go back, different elements of what makes sustainable use kind of operational, or how we can describe different elements of sustainable use, from, you know, from obviously kind of ecological criteria through to, you know, providing and ensuring traditional knowledge is respected, and integration of that knowledge into the use through the respect of laws. And the different colors here, I mean different type of use, and that's the way they were categorized by the IBA Sustainable Use Assessment Report. And the bigger is the graph for each of the types of the agreements or schemes or legally binding instruments, kind of the better it is. So the more we see the coverage, the better it is, because it means that there are some rules and norms. So either our legislation at the national level, or existing voluntary standards and norms, or existing intergovernmental agreements somehow cover different aspects of it. So this paints a picture that actually isn't very positive, because it suggests that there are really big gaps in how the statuses of what makes use sustainable, or what could lead to sustainable use, are implemented. So quite a lot of work to do. What are some ways to deal with this? And, you know, I want to offer here that there are sets of regulatory and non-regulatory proxy measures and tools that can be used. So, of course, at the national level, at the very basic level, we talk about an existence potentially of a national legislation which may kind of control or describe or prescribe the conditions under which use, trade is sustainable. We know from the sustainable use kind of practical applications that it can be quite tricky, actually, because for many species, such as medicinal plants and fungi, under-regulation rather than over-regulation is a preferred approach, because we are in a really complicated space of ensuring equitable access to areas, ensuring equitable use approaches, and benefit sharing. So I think it's a very complex matter. But to give some examples of the tools that exist, so while mostly apply to CITES listed species, for example, for species that are listed on CITES and can be traded, they have to be a non-detriment finding has to be completed for them, which basically is a demonstration of sustainability. There are some really good tools and instruments out there that can demonstrate that trade is sustainable at the population at the national level. Those are very helpful to keep in mind when we think about CITES listed species, and of course they can be used for species beyond CITES. On the non-regulatory side, there are multiple types of approaches that can be used. And we can see this through the Global Biodiversity Framework, the encouragement to include multiple stakeholders. So, of course, governments have specific commitment because they're the ones that are signing up to the targets of GBF and express how they're going to do it in their national biodiversity strategy and action plans. But there is also encouragement for private sector, for instance, to contribute to the delivery of Global Biodiversity Framework, as well as NGOs, research institutions, and so on. So I have pictures here of a few different tools. If you're interested in a specific field, for instance, a shark and ray traceability approach, there is Coalition to End Wildlife Trafficking Online that again signs up companies to ensure that the trade online, trafficking online is stopped. And those are many. There are multiple tools and resources. They are kind of, I think, IOC and SSC is involved in plenty of them, and I think some good approach could be in future around maybe better repository or better bringing together of those tools together. I want to talk a little bit about how we think about sustainability and maybe offer a new vision of it, and invite you to participate as well. And I think it's very relevant under Target 5 as well as 9. So arguably, sustainability is, of course, as we learn in the university and schools, is including the elements of ecological, social, and economic sustainability. Of course, often when we talk about the sustainability in the context of our work on species conservation, I think quite often we stop at the point of ecological sustainability. We'd like to challenge this and, have a really, in terms of sustainable use of species, I think we need to be very careful about trying to understand what makes a system sustainable, what makes a use sustainable from a number of perspectives. So a set of partners led by the IUCN Sustainable Use and Livelihood Specialist Group in Traffic have been working on something we called a 5-dimensional sustainability assessment framework. And what we're trying to do here is to come up with a minimum set of feasible, meaningful criteria and principles that could describe a good outcome and good sustainability. Because we know sustainability of wild species use in particular is extremely diverse. We're talking about harvesting of fungi, about small-scale fisheries, about harvesting of timber species, and so on and so on. And in every single situation, in every single country, it's very different. So we talk really about the multiple shades and meaning of how sustainability can be interpreted. So we came up with the initial framework reviewing all the possible standards, regulations, NDF guidance that we could get our hands on. We've convened a multi-stakeholder expert group and came up with this assessment framework that is now available for testing. I'm sure somebody will put it in the chat as well. And I'd really like to encourage you, if you have any case study of whether good practice or bad practice, or you're not sure what practice it is, it's a very simple checklist. It's an Excel sheet that. And our idea is that if it's tested in a number of different circumstances, it can actually be refined, and we could come up with a framework that is serviceable and useful for individual cases where we think about species use at the national level to bring together stakeholders and discuss sustainability, and also to start thinking about how we can additionally measure this big Target 5. And you'll see, so this diagram is a sample of what an outcome could look like at the moment. So very simple idea. But the 5 dimensions are ecological, economic, and social. So the ones we know about already, but it also includes human health and animal welfare issues, as well as cross-cutting issues such as traceability, compliance with laws. And so trying to tack on to those issues of harvest, use, and trade being legal, sustainable, and safe. So please help us. We'd love to get more of it being tested and being a useful tool. Also, really little plug, and this is very really related to this 5D sustainability framework. So Sustainable Use and Livelihood Specialist Group started to put together something called SPUD, or Sustainable Use Database, which is really about trying to improving the knowledge and understanding of how various species are used, where they're used, whether the use is sustainable or not. As you can see, it doesn't contain huge amount of case studies yet, because it is just at the formative stage. We need help filling it in. We're of course in discussion with various different databases, and of course working a lot with the Red List database to try and bring together as many case studies as we can. And by the way, it doesn't bias us to only document sustainable use case studies. We want this repository to actually be a species use database and something that gives us an indication of trends in future. Finally, I'll give a little plug for a piece of work or an example of work that we're doing in Nepal, high altitude Himalayas, a really complex space. We work with communities with multiple communities, community forest user groups in high altitude Himalayas, where the very sensitive species are harvested commercially. They are Nardostachys jatamansi. It is appendix to listed species. It's a critically endangered species, and it's always challenging all the assumptions that I think quite often we hear people have about sustainable use of wild species. The reality of this trade is that cultivation is extremely restricted, because we're talking about very high altitude in the mountains, and cultivation trials haven't been successful so far, and they haven't been also commercially successful. And there is about 15,000 households with very little other access to income that depend on this trade. So it's trying to find the adaptive management under which, under certain conditions, sustainable use of this species, even though it is assessed as critically endangered on IUCN Red List, can still be possible. So inviting you to have a look at the WildCheck platform. Is a platform that starts bringing together a bit of resources on wild plants trade, potentially fungi expansion, and piloting and scaling up these ideas and challenging ourselves about thinking how sustainable use can be a conservation measure. Because quite often I think we put the use question somehow always in the space of threat. I think sustainable use can be an extremely effective tool. And I could not go away from this webinar without mentioning indicators, because I think we all have to. What gets measured gets managed, not my quote, of course, very famous quote. So at the moment for target 5, I think we have an issue with indicators. So there is one headline indicator that's been approved, which focuses on fish stocks. And this is good, and it relies on an incredibly good set of data that's been managed by UN Food and Agriculture Organization for a very long time. However, of course, that headline indicator doesn't give us any indication of anything happening in terrestrial or freshwater systems. Oh, maybe that's freshwater. I don't think it does. And so one thing I wanted to draw your attention to is this addition of an indicator, a component indicator called Sustainable Use of Wild Species, which is in development. It's kind of co-led by Traffic, IUCN Sustainable Use and Livelihood Specialist Group, collaborative partnership on sustainable wildlife management. We'd love to put hands together and really kind of try and understand how we could come up with an indicator on an issue which we know is going to be extremely complex, as is demonstrated by some of these shades of sustainability and the complexity of its measurement. We want this indicator to be relevant nationally, that could then be aggregated to the global level. So it's a really big challenge, and we'd love to work with separate countries and obviously all specialist groups that are interested on this. So get in touch. So final slide, just finishing here. So I've deliberately put in bold sustainable in the first bullet point, just to be very clear that what we're talking about with target 5 is very important. It can be an important contribution to conservation of species ecosystem when it is done sustainably, legally, and safe. It's very important that there is this global commitment. I think we have a pathway and a straightforward strategy on how to start implementing this. We do know we need better indicators and probably provide quite a lot of help to parties as well and guidance on how we can assist. But my hope is that some of the tools that I've showed now, there are regulatory, non-regulatory measures, but also approaches such as this 5D sustainability assessment framework. Our hope is that it can be really helpful for use. There is this complexity, and I deliberately mentioned target 9 connection in the beginning and haven't touched it again, but the connection to how much and how and to who the benefits and costs of sustainable use and trade along the trade chains occur is extremely important for the success of target 5. So, this challenging of the narrative of sustainable use is very important, so that it's multidimensional really. And then finally, I think, we often see use of wild species very kind of marginalized or put in the corner as one of the very separate issues. I think that it belongs in much wider narratives around nature positive and green economy and natural capital, and the things that we hear being discussed in the policy levels, and probably also drive with them funding. Would love to see more and more examples and case studies that demonstrate that sustainable use can be a viable conservation and livelihood strategy and actually lead to species survival. And I think we have all the tools to do this. So just to implementation now. Thank you very much.
We've lost John Paul. I'll just crack on. So I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about Target 6, which is invasive alien species. Kevin's unable to join us today, so I'm presenting on behalf of both of us and the IUCN and the Invasive Species Survival Group. So just as an overview, so we're all aware of the definitions around invasive species. We're talking about species out with their native or natural ranges, and species that tend to establish, spread and lead to negative impacts on nature or nature's contributions to people. You'll also hear me talking about pathways. These are the ways in which species move from one area to another through human activity, which may be intentional or unintentional. And biological invasion refers to the entire process. I will start by referring to IPBES as well, and we're fortunate to have the thematic assessment report produced last August. The final typeset version of the full report became available last week, and that link's available for you to go and have a look at. And as well on that webpage are some fact sheets, so digested, summarised, easy to access components there for you to have a look at. There were contributions from 86 lead author experts who are members of the ISSG, contributing from 49 different countries and summarising over 13,000 references. So a huge piece of work which provides this evidence base and useful recommendations to inform action on the Global Biodiversity Framework. So to remind you of our Target 6, again, just sort of highlighting some of the words. But if we split down some of these words, we can identify where there is the aim, to eliminate, minimize, or reduce impacts of invasive species. And we can also highlight the actions associated with the target. So identifying and managing pathways, thinking about preventing impacts of future invasive species, also thinking about the species that are established and present and looking at removing or mitigating the impact of those, particularly from these priority sites and islands. Throughout the target, it also highlights prioritization, and this is associated with both species, pathways, and sites. So clearly we need ways of identifying what the priorities in each of these areas are in order to be able to meet the target. Did I mention we also have this quantitative element to the target? So that this middle blue section that is measurable. So we can look at the number of species that are being established across all priority invasive alien species. And we can also look at the establishment rate, and we want to reduce that by 50% by 2030. So there is a clear measurable component to the target. The Species Survival Commission have set out some high-level actions for Target 6, which you can see here in the form of the Global Species Action Plan. And the SSC can also provide additional guidance and support in these actions. And I'm just going to highlight a few of the tools and activities that ISSG have been working towards and maintaining. So the first is the Global Invasive Species Database, which holds over 1,000 different accounts of individual species. So you can search up a species if it's new to your area, if it's one that you're not familiar with, and find out what management is being carried out in other places and different information about it, whether it's about its impacts or its main methods of spread or the pathways by which it moves around. In terms of impacts, a framework has been developed, which has now been adopted as an IUCN standard. This is the Environmental Impact Classification of Alien Taxa, or the ICAT system. And this allows us to determine whether the scale of the impact that an invasive species may have. And these are assessed where there is adequate data and allows us to inform our prioritization using this as an evidence base. And again, those links to these resources are available. We also have a global register of introduced and invasive species, or GRIS, and these are validated checklists that are available at a national level that allow you to search to see which are the known invasive species and allow us to identify where invasive alien species are present, and will be a useful database and evidence base for an indicator on this rate of establishment by knowing which species are where at a particular time point. The ISSG has produced a number of publications and guidelines and support. In Europe, this has been particularly around the EU regulation. In 2014, a series of species were identified and listed. This species list is now at 88 species of union concern that where there are restrictions on their movement. There are plans in place to prevent their or to ensure that their pathways are managed, and there are shared resources on the management and restoration of the habitats and species that they're impacting. ICN has also provided a range of documentation and guidance on pathways and their management, looking at vertebrates and humane aspects of that. So thinking about animal welfare in terms of the management and some surveillance and customs guides. And this is just a selection or example of some of that documentation that's available. And of course, we also have lots of academic publications and frameworks and methods for prioritization and for some of this assessment of the impacts of species and on ecosystems. But this is not necessarily the most easy to work out which is the method we should be using, which framework should be adopted. So we have been working to pull together a toolkit, this is with the IUCN and the CBD, to support the implementation of Target 6. The main thinking behind this is to align with the work that's been done through the IPBES assessment, to make sure that we're using that same sort of terminology when we develop a toolkit. To make it a dynamic resource, we're not setting out one way of doing things, but we want to make all of these resources that are available that would be useful to parties when they're considering Target 6, that they can find them in one easy to access place. However, we're aware that this could become a massive document or list, so we don't want it to become impenetrable. We want it to have the ability that you could dip in and out of the sections that you need. And to enable this, we will need to provide some guidance and allow parties that have different capabilities and resources, or have perhaps made a start in some areas but not other areas, to be able to access the parts of the toolkit that are relevant to them. So if we go back to the target, we have looked to see what you would need to achieve this and split the target out, highlighted here with the different colours, into different sections. So picking out where we would need a species list, a list of species that are not yet in the country that may potentially invade. So that would, or horizon species list, that would allow us to start to quantify that indicator. We would need some knowledge about the impacts the species are having, so that might be where the ICAT assessment would come in, and we'd need some knowledge of management methods to be able to control or eradicate species where that's possible. So we took this from the target and set about trying to work out a logical flow to pull all of this information together, and how people might start to access this information. What questions might arise and be related to each of these sections. That allowed us to then group the needs and these questions to different components. So we highlighted these 5 main components that would need to occur to be able to have this evaluation of target 6. So some sort of knowledge about what the system is, what species we have, what species do we need to protect, or areas do we need to protect, and what data are available, what species do we have, what species might arrive, and where might they come from. There would then be a section on analysis and decision making, thinking about risk assessment and risk management, feasibility options, and prioritization. This is where the prioritization methods would come in. There would be some surveillance, monitoring these introduction rates, monitoring the establishment rates, and then methods to prevent entry and establishment of new species would include features such as biosecurity, how to set that up, what infrastructure needs would there be, and what legislation might be needed to support that action. So taking those sort of higher level components, we can think about a framework in which the guidance might sit, and where these different needs to support the target would fall. We can then think about what outputs you would get from being able to have all of these components, and where the different frameworks and guidance that I highlighted earlier would sit within this repository. Of course, we would need some supporting guidance. This is the part we're thinking about now, is how to link some support in there to access all of this information, how to signpost people to the parts of the toolkit that are most relevant to them. And beyond just thinking about individual parties or nations, we need to think about regional networks and how to work together as a community. And I've picked this diagram just to finish with from the IPBES reports in the summary for policymakers. And the roots and branches approach just highlights this sort of need for working across and sharing resources as we develop these tools, and the need for the toolkit in the first place. I'd be happy to take any questions on this afterwards. So thank you very much.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. It's been really, really information-packed series of talks. We have about 20 minutes left for questions, so plenty of time for exchange. I was disconnected briefly from the internet, so I probably do not have all the questions on the Q&A window, but I will go with what I have, and if anybody sees others that I'm missing, please jump in and let me know. But there's a question from Oliver Ryder for Sean. It says the Earth Biogenome Program intends to produce reference genomes for all known eukaryotic species. Do you see this contributing to the assessment, monitoring, and management of biodiversity? Sean, over to you.
Sure, thanks, Ali. I think there's a role for genomic data, certainly. So we designed the indicators for genetic diversity, which I talked about, so that they can be applied to all species now, even in the absence of genetic data. As we get more genetic data for more species, we can include that in different ways. So whole genomes can tell us definitely about genetic threats to species, and we should incorporate that either into the indicators themselves or into some complementary measure. But certainly that can tell us about inbreeding and how much a species population size has changed over time, which is also very important.
Excellent, thank you. I had a question from Danny Demanto and Anastasia, but it disappeared on my screen. Was it already answered? Danny, I think that you could speak up. Naomi, are participants allowed to ask questions live?
Yes, I think so. We can give him permission. Just 1 second.
Well, in the meantime, we have one question. Lu Yan, has a hand raised. Could you please try to speak? Oh, no, hands down. Danny, you want to try live? I don't see any more questions. Oh yeah, there's some more questions there. Well, from an anonymous attendee, I would like to know how these tools and indicators and metrics are being rolled out to governments so they can be used. What kind of efforts, anybody would like to mention efforts that are being pursued?
I can do this for our indicators. We realized very early on that to make indicators useful, you have to engage with governments and other stakeholders. So we started at COP15 by making contacts with some of the national focal points, and we have worked in our webinars to include other national focal points. And we are testing the indicators in partnership with biodiversity agencies within countries. So within the national biodiversity agencies, which are in most cases responsible for producing the national reports. We have a really long way to go because there's 196 parties, but we have made contacts with 9 countries' national biodiversity agencies to test the indicators, and our partners in those agencies are elevating our results up to leadership. And we have several other partnerships in progress, a total of about a dozen, still, again, a long way to go. But we are also, and in webinars like this, we probably should be making efforts to reach out to the focal points for the CBD and SBSTA and other meetings.
Yeah, I just want to add from the perspective of the Species Survival Commission, we have been working on a global effort called Reverse the Red. And I invite any of the participants to visit the Reverse the Red website in those terms specifically. The main objective of Reverse the Red is precisely that, is to engage the national level and try to make sure that we provide support for people to use a UCN knowledge product for a list of species, for a list of ecosystem KVAs, World Database of Protected Areas, and there are many partners involved in developing these data as well. But we want to make sure that they're well known and well used. We're having the World Species Congress on 15 May. Please visit the website, 15 May this year. It's an online 24-hour event, also focused very strongly on supporting governments and getting governments to participate actively. And we'll also be launching something that we are calling another effort called the MBSAP Reverse the Red Medal. It's a medal that we, again, no time today to talk about it in great detail, but the main purpose is to again support governments in their uptake and use of these tools and incorporation to the national plans, building strong national teams to carry them forward and so on. So please visit Reverse the Red and join us in the World Species Congress. Phil, over to you.
Just going to jump in and add to Sean. Sean's group has done a fantastic job of trying to reach out to parties. But I think now that we are past COP15, many countries are in the position where, or most countries should be in the position where they are aligning their existing commitments with the new Global Biodiversity Framework in terms of new national biodiversity strategies and action plans. So it does mean that many parties are overwhelmed with approaches from not just from an organisation like IUCN, which I think rightly prides itself on being science-led, but there are also many NGOs that have got particular advocacy, and obviously in many cases they're agendas that we would support. But it does mean that parties are receiving a lot of input. So I think we have to be quite careful and and take advantages of opportunities as they arise. So we're developing, or I suppose inevitably having worked as our previous guise as the post-2020 Biodiversity Targets Task Force, reasonable relationships with the CBD Secretariat. So working through the Secretariat and being in a position where we can provide, for example, information documents to COP, and then there's also two other major bodies that inform the work of the Conference of the Parties, and they've both got horrible names. SBSTA is the subsidiary body on science, technology and technological advice, essentially the science group. And then there's the subsidiary body on implementation, which is essentially the body that works to make sure that the work of the CBD is being implemented. So there are ways of engaging parties at and around those events. So I think we've got to be quite careful and strategic and take as many opportunities as we can. Sean's group has really done a fantastic job of making individual contacts, and I'm sure that different groups within IUCN Species Survival Commission has got different contacts. And if there is a way, I mean, we obviously, within the Global Biodiversity Framework Task Force, would be more than happy to try and be a bit of a directory for where we've got particular links with particular focal points or particular delegations. But there's 2 or 3 different ways, I think, that we have got to work to try and have an impact. They want our message, they want the support that we can provide, but many countries are overwhelmed with the amount of work they have to do in country and the approaches that they get from others.
Great, thank you. Several people have asked about whether the recording of this webinar will be available. Yes, it'll be posted on Facebook and YouTube later on in a few days. In the meantime, a couple more questions. So go to Roy. It's like a comment and a question, but I think the main point is that there are some, well, I'll read it. There are some indicators that will link to deal with other indicators and other aspects of biodiversity. There are also some indicators that will change or gain more prominence as the world changes through climate change. How dynamic and adaptive are the indicators? Are these indicators designed to capture this dynamism? I don't know if Phil, you want to take that one?
Yep, I can jump in and give my perspective, but Sean, I'm sure we'll also have a view, as may Aileen and Nastia. Last time with the HE biodiversity targets, they were very conscious that there was no established indicator framework at the beginning. Some of the indicators that we used in 2020 to report on progress were only developed, one that we developed here the year before, or 2 years before. So the intention from a political point of view this time was to have agreed indicator framework in place right at the beginning. Unfortunately, the 2 processes, agreeing the indicators and agreeing the actual global biodiversity framework, were being overseen by 2 different parts of CBD. So we were not in a position where they were actively being discussed at the same time. So in the open-ending working group that was developing the global biodiversity framework, you'd often hear comments that if we knew what indicators were being considered that would help us frame the wording for some of these goals and targets. So we've ended up in the position, and I saw a comment by Luna, I think, about human-wildlife conflict and coexistence. That's a very, very good example of an issue that the framework wanted to address, but there is no indicator in existence. So there had some discussion, should we only go for the framework to include issues where we know we can measure progress? And they did rein back from that, but there are some issues, and genetic diversity was obviously another example where the whole issue is so new to CBD because it hadn't really addressed it adequately in HE Biodiversity Target 13, that thinking what's an appropriate target which we can measure progress towards. So that's a longer answer to indicate the challenge that we face at the moment. So there are many in the current indicator framework has got a lot of gaps. There is an ad hoc technical expert group that will be finishing its work in May and reporting to SBSTA. Then their work will come up for discussion at COP16 on the indicator framework, but that's only going to look at part of it, the headline indicators. And then underneath that, there's another category called the component indicators. And then underneath that, yet another category called complementary indicators, which are really voluntary and parties can use those and others where they think that's appropriate. So the challenge is that politically, the process should not be, they don't want it to be particularly dynamic. But in reality, it does look as though there are going to be so many gaps still after COP16 that I'm sure that if we, and thinking in our case, target 4, if we really can work hard in the next year or two to develop an adequate, robust indicator, I think we can make a very strong case for COP, considering that perhaps at COP17. So in theory, it's fixed, but in reality, there may be an opportunity if we've got a robust indicator that fills a gap, and there are plenty of gaps.
Excellent, thank you. I see we have an anonymous attendee who has 2 questions, which I think are for Sean. The first one is about reference genomes and what is the minimum standard and gold standard for assessing biodiversity. What would you suggest is the minimum quality of genome sequence what you generate? And then related, perhaps, is are there any gene banks from marine forest and seagrasses? Is the UCN involved? So that's over to you, Sean.
Thanks. Those are tough questions. I'll briefly add to Phil's comment just on the robustness of indicators. It's a really important thing, and especially the genetic diversity indicator, making it robust to future technologies and future concerns is important to think about. In terms of reference genomes, I think it's a pretty technical question, but I would say that the IUCN Conservation Genetic Specialist Group is available for consultation on that kind of question. And then for gene banks or similar for seagrasses, this I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know on that. I think I would only say that for those species, I don't know the biology of seagrasses, but if they there are a lot of species, including trees, which cannot be conserved in seed banks. And so we have to consider alternative ways of conserving their genetics, such as in botanic gardens. I don't know what kind of alternative we would have for seagrasses. So I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for that question.
That's fine. Eileen, I see you answering to an anonymous attendee on your typing, but maybe you want to give it a shot online. It's a question about the private sector and the provision of funds.
I was just checking up on some details around that. Funding is always an issue. The Global Environment Fund, though, have the Global Biodiversity Fund, which specifically mentions invasive species, I believe. So that is one stream that I am aware of that would support work in this area. But yes, I agree that it is difficult to find sustainable funding streams for these support of particularly ongoing management costs. And, you know, I think the direction should be more on prevention and the infrastructure for biosecurity rather than on the ongoing costs as per you know, the guidance on how's best and where's most effective to manage invasive species. But in terms of specifics about the private sector, I know that there's work going on in that area, but I don't have details.
Please feel free, I mean, to all the audience, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A or any hands raised, but please feel free to reach out to us. Oh, a new Q&A question came up. Greeting to Dr. McGowan after 15 years. What are your thoughts on rewilding species such as the Arabian bustard? How do you see? Yeah, well, you could read it and maybe give it a quick little shot.
Yes, okay. The question has just disappeared. Let me just quickly find it. Yeah. Gosh, 15 years. That's a very long time, Zafar. Yes. What are your recommendations on delisting of the threatened species to lower scale on the IUCN Red List? I'm not going to venture a view on delisting of threatened species. I assume you mean downlisting to least concern. So the way that the Red List process works clearly is that it is the taxonomic experts that will be, or the species experts who will be undertaking those Red List assessments, and they will know far more about Arabian leopard than me. Such as Arabian to low scale on the Red List, the population of several species of birds has declined. Yeah, well, those clearly are of concern. Declines of any species are of concern according to the goal A, as I was talking about. So efforts to address those, whether it is at the, if you like, the lower level of concern in terms of healthy and resilient populations, or up at the higher end of concern, avoiding extinctions, clearly the framework, the Global Biodiversity Framework now should capture declines of all species and try to do something about that. One thing that doesn't come out in that wording that I presented with the goals and targets, but is that underlies the timings that they've talked about in the framework, is a phrase that I suspect many people have heard: bending the curve of biodiversity loss. So the idea is that a lot of these declines will be stopped by 2030, and then the declines sort of bottom out, if you like, and then between 2030 and 2050 we do then begin to see recovery. So looking at the comment, your final question, your thoughts on rewilding such species and critical habitat, that's clearly going to be fundamental to many species being restored to their previous geographic range, their area of habitat. So absolutely, rewilding is going to be very, very important for some species to, thinking specifically about the Red List, for some species to actually move off that Red List. There will be a need for new habitat and for those species to be fully distributed throughout that new habitat. So rewilding is going to be a very important part of the restoration component of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which I think is specifically target 2. There is a target on restoration.
Great, thank you. We have about 3 minutes left or 2 minutes left, and a couple of, I'll just take Cristina Lopez Gallego's question about the link between national species specialist groups and this task force. I don't think the task force should, I mean, the group should be part of the task force, but I do think that there's certainly very close links that we have to work on. So that's an area, and Phil has been very interested, expressed many times interest in connecting with National Species Specialist Group. So let's work on that. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. We have Scott Thomas with a hand up. I'll just read quickly one question and then give the floor to Scott. Annette, she says, in Australia, the government uses a legislative licensing and reporting system for monitoring wildlife surveys for biodiversity conservation. Sustainable use associated with its licensees, the GIS data such as Bionet could assist with Red List assessments. Yeah, that's right. They'll be very interested. We'll be very interested in hearing about those. Oh, Scott, sorry, that was my mistake. Okay, thank you. We are very keen to the new Red List Partnership Agreement is very keen to look into new techniques and automation. So I'll be very keen to hear more about those efforts if you would like to share them with us. So it's 29 minutes after the hour. I would like to thank Aileen, Anastasia, Sean, and Phil for a very inspiring webinar. We've had some fantastic feedback, very good attendance. Usually these webinars get many more views after, so I'm sure that will be the case as well. And thank you so much to all the participants, all the team behind the scenes,